Okay, for today's read aloud, we're going to try to get through two chapters. And the first chapter, chapter 12, is called Only Birds. They were surrounded by crowds all day as their parents took them out and on one last round of sightseeing before their return to the United States. Sarah kept a tight grip on her backpack, and they both spent more time nervously scanning the sky than looking at whatever sight they were supposed to be seeing. But there was no sign of ravens. They took turns sleeping at night. Aidan stayed up until 2 a.m., then woke up Sarah, who kept watch until dawn. Both of them glanced hundreds of times at their window, and both of them tensed each time they heard footsteps in the hall. But as far as they could tell, the birds had not returned, and nobody came to their door. They argued, sometimes heatedly, about what to do with the box. Aidan insisted they had to get rid of it, either by turning it over to the police or simply leaving it behind. Sarah did not trust the police and was utterly opposed to abandoning the box. The argument resumed after breakfast as they packed for their trip home. "If we keep it," said Aidan, jamming a pair of jeans into his suitcase, "he'll come after us again. If we leave it, he'll get it." "Sarah, you saw what happened to the doorman. Do you want that to happen to us?" "No," Sarah answered, grunting as she zipped her bulging suitcase closed. "But it won't happen to us because we're leaving England." "What if he comes after us?" "Aidan, we'll be an ocean away." "How do you know he won't come?" "It's too far, Aidan. He lives here. The birds live here." Aidan was silent for a minute, then he said, "You don't really know. You are just guessing. I'm going to go tell Mom and Dad." Sarah stared at him. "You wouldn't," she said softly. Tears welled in Aidan's eyes. "I would. I'm not going to die for that stupid box. I hate that we ever found it. Leave it here or I'm telling them. Do you understand me?" Sarah held his gaze for a moment. "Yeah, I understand." Now we switch scenes to the airport. Heathrow Airport was, as always, insane, its endless, dingy corridors, a chaotic swarm of travelers arriving from and departing from points all over the world. It took the Coopers an hour to get boarding passes, to check their luggage, and make their way to the security checkpoints. They shuffled along in line, finally reaching the screening area, where they placed their carry-on bags on the belt for the x-ray machine. Tom first, followed by Natalie, Aidan, and Sarah. "Whose bag is this?" said a security screener, pointed to Sarah's backpack as it emerged from the machine. "Mine," said Sarah. "No, I'm just going to have a look," said the screener. Aidan looked back at her. Ahead of them, their parents were gathering their things. Natalie was talking about doing some duty-free shopping. "Sarah," said Aidan. She shook her head. The screener had opened the backpack and was poking around inside, and he pointed to something when he said, "Wait a second, what's this?" "A jewelry box," said Sarah. "Is that gold?" said the screener. "Yes," said Sarah. The screener looked at it for a moment, then pushed it back in the backpack, across to Sarah with a look that said, "Unbelievable, these rich Americans." "Thank you," said Sarah, trying not to betray her relief as she picked up the backpack. She brushed past Aidan, not meeting his furious gaze, and started toward where their parents stood waiting in the huge, bustling lounge area. Aidan grabbed her arm and stopped. "You lied to me, Sarah." "No, I didn't." "Yes, you did. You said you'd leave it." "I didn't say that, Aidan. I said I understood you, and I do understand what you're saying. You don't want to be a part of this. Okay, I understand. You're not a part of it anymore." "But how can I—" "Will you kids hurry up?" called Tom. Aidan looked toward their father. "Aidan, do not tell him. Please." For a few seconds they stared at each other. Aidan jerked his arm loose and began walking, where he reached Tom, and he stopped and looked back at Sarah. "Please," Sarah mouthed. Without speaking to his father, Aidan turned and started walking again. We fast forward a little bit further. Outside the airport ramp, about 100 yards from the lounge, a baggage handler stood next to a jet being ready for departure to the United States. He was weighing his baggage. He turned around. Had he turned around, he would have seen a large raven landing 20 feet from where he stood. And then another, and another. Had the baggage handler looked up, he would have seen many, many more birds, some of them on the edge of the terminal roof, others perched along the windows. The ravens had started gathering 2 hours earlier when the Coopers had emerged from the hotel. As they climbed into their taxi, a bird perched on the hotel roof had emitted a cry and taken a wing. It was quickly joined by others by nearby treetops and rooftops. By the time the taxi was passing Hyde Park, There were a dozen blackbirds flying above it through the light fog. And as the taxi pulled onto the M5 motorway, the dozen had become 50. Soon there were more than 100. Flights of birds were no strange sights in London. Geese and ducks sometimes flew in gigantic Vs, slicing across the London sky like arrows. The few people who saw the ravens thought nothing of it. It was only birds. When the taxi reached Heathrow Airport and the Coopers were inside, the ravens had dispersed to the roof, some perching near windows. And as the Coopers made their way through the terminal, passing the windows along the way, the birds shifted, getting even closer to the U.S.-bound jet, where a growing mass of them now gathered behind the baggage handler. Sensing their motion, the handler turned and almost jumped at the sight of so many birds. He thought they must have been feeding on something as they were so concentrated. Birds were dangerous to jet engines, so he stepped closer to shoo them away, and he expected them to flee. But they didn't flee. Instead, they condensed into a tightly packed mass, moving as one, and rose into a shape that looked like a human silhouette. The baggage handler, more astonished than scared, of course they were only birds, wished he had a camera. He was about to call out for his coworkers to come have a look, and that was when his shadow touched the edge of the mass of birds. And that was the last thing he remembered. Moments later, his eyes, now pitch black and expressionless, he opened one of the plane's rear cargo doors, and instantly the birds changed shape. Looking now like a snake, they streamed their way across the tarmac and into the cargo hold of the ship, where the birds dispersed and disappeared into the dark recesses. More swooped down from the terminal building and went inside. 100, 200, 300, vanishing in the gloom. The baggage handler stood next to the baggage convoy belt, his expression unchanging, his eyes staring at nothing. The tug arrived, pulling a train of cars full of luggage of every shape and size. "Tim, you okay, mate? We up late?" Tim didn't say anything. "You want inside or out?" the driver asked. One man would feed the bags on the conveyor belt from the bottom. The other would pull them into the hold and pack them tightly into netted bays inside. Without a word, Tim climbed into the conveyor belt and disappeared inside the plane. The driver shrugged, started the conveyor belt, and in 10 minutes the bags were loaded. As Tim, on his knees near the entrance to the hold, stowed the last bag, a dark shape swooped past, brushing against him. With a groan, he fell over sideways. "Tim, you all right, mate?" Tim sat up, blinking, dazed. He looked down at the driver. How did I get up here?" "What do you mean, how'd you get up there? You climbed up there. We just loaded the bags." Tim looked around at the loaded bags. He shook his head, confused. Gingerly, he climbed down the conveyor belt. "Are you okay, Timmy?" "I don't know. Did you see any birds around?" "Birds? A few, maybe. Why?" Tim thought for a moment, then shook his head. Never mind. It was only birds." The driver climbed back on the tug, and as he started the engine, he called, "Get some rest, Timmy boy. You're looking like a zombie today." Sarah, having just taken her seat next to Aidan, looked out the window. Toward the back of the plane, she saw 2 airport workers talking. One of them drove away. The other stood for a moment, rubbing his head, then turned and looked at the plane. Sarah got a good look at his face. He looked troubled. After a few moments, he shook his head and turned and walked away. The pilot announced that the bags had all been loaded and that the pre-flight check-ins were complete. "We'll be on our way shortly," he said. Sarah turned to Aidan as he spoke for both of them. "I am so glad to be getting out of here." And that's the end of the chapter. So what's critical about this chapter is, of course, Sarah and Aidan don't have the information that we have, in that we know that whatever form Umbra has taken with these birds is aboard the plane, and it's headed back to the United States with them. They're not aware of that, and Umbra continues to take shadows. Now, the next chapter is called Mrs. Tremaine. It's chapter 13. And we will see the story shift a little bit. And it's going to make this a little bit longer of a read aloud, but I think it'll be worth it. Okay. When they finally got home, Sarah and Aidan went straight to their rooms, enjoying the luxury once again of having their own space and their own stuff. They kept themselves busy. Sarah was on Facebook, Aidan with his video games, and the hot, humid summer afternoon turned to dusk. They ate a quick dinner with their parents, then drifted back to their rooms. Just after 9 p.m., Sarah tapped on Aidan's door. "Come in," he said, not taking his eyes off the TV screen. "Can I talk to you for a second?" said Sarah, entering his room. Reluctantly, Aidan paused Fortnite. What? You know what. Oh, that. Where'd you put it? In my closet under a bunch of junk. Which is why we should have left it in England, said Aidan. Let's not go over that again, okay? It's here now. Thanks to you. Sarah moved a step closer. I've been thinking. Uh-oh. Aidan, listen, I think we need to find the star catchers. What? We have to find them and give them the box. They're the only ones who can protect it. That's what they do. What makes you think there are even star catchers? There have to be. The star stuff's real, and Amber's real. Definitely. So the star catchers have to be real too. Sarah, those stories in those books, that was like 100 years ago. Even if those star catcher people were real, they're all dead now. Unless they had children, they'd teach them to be star catchers. That's what they always did. They kept the star catchers going for hundreds of years. I bet they're out there somewhere. We just have to find them. Okay, let's say we did. The books were set in England. Where would their descendants live? Oh, people move all over the place. Besides, we wouldn't know until we find them. How come you keep saying we? You told me I didn't have to be a part of this anymore. If you don't want to help, you don't have to. Aidan looked away. I thought you said we'd be safe once we left England. I think we're safe, but I also think we have to... Wait a second, what was that? Said Aidan. What was what? I saw something. He looked to the window. What? Outside the window. Something was moving, and it was black. Sarah peered out. The night was overcast. A light over the kitchen doors provided what little illumination there was in the backyard, revealing only a ghostly outline of a big oak, its twisted branches perfectly still on the windless nights. I don't see anything. Well, I did. Okay, maybe you saw a bird. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. Aidan, there's always birds here. She was interrupted by a doorbell chime echoing in the foyer. She and Aidan looked at each other, saying nothing. From downstairs there came the sound of the door opening and their parents' voices, followed by another unfamiliar voice. A minute later there were footsteps on the stairs. Sarah, said Natalie's voice. In here. Natalie opened the door. She looked worried. Mrs. Tremaine is here? She wants to speak with you? Mrs. Tremaine was their longtime next-door neighbor, a woman in their early 80s whose children were grown and whose husband had died 2 years earlier. She was friendly enough, but she didn't talk with the Coopers and never spoke with Sarah. She wants to talk with me? Said Sarah. Yeah, I'm worried about her, too. She's acting a little strange, said Natalie. Strange how? Well, for one thing, she's wearing sunglasses and it's pitch black out. I guess she could have eye problems, but her behavior, it's just strange. And her voice sounds weird. Sarah and Aidan looked at each other. Please come downstairs. She's insistent that she wants to talk to you. Let's find out what this is all about, okay? Sarah hesitated. Sarah, come on, said her mother. They saw what he was looking at. Mrs. Tremaine was a tall, rail-thin woman with a narrow face, her hair dyed in a natural shade of brown, with gray peeking out at the top. She wore a loose-fitting, light blue house dress. As Natalie had said, she was wearing sunglasses. She was standing beneath the chandelier. Aidan tapped Sarah's shoulder and pointed furtively to the floor. Sarah's eyes widened. Mrs. Tremaine had no shadow. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and Mrs. Tremaine stood perfectly still as her head swiveled slowly to face Sarah. Her mouth opened, but her voice wasn't hers. It didn't sound like a voice at all. It sounded like the moan of a winter wind. Give it to me, the voice said. Sarah took an involuntary step back. Natalie put her arm around her daughter. Give you what, Mrs. Tremaine? Are you okay? Without any indication what she had heard, Mrs. Tremaine took a step toward Natalie and Sarah. Her upper body seemed rigid. She moved as if she were gliding. The awful voice came again. Give it to me. Aidan looked down. Mrs. Tremaine's shoe was only inches from Natalie's shadow. Mom, move. What? Said Natalie. Why are you... Ugh! She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes fluttering shut as Mrs. Tremaine's right foot brushed against her shadow. In a flash, Aidan darted forward, hands out. He shoved his mother hard, knocking her shadow away from Mrs. Tremaine. Natalie, her eyes still closed, stumbled across the foyer. Tom leaped forward to grab her just as she fell. Aidan, what are you doing? Stay away from her, said Aidan, pointing to Mrs. Tremaine. Sarah jumped back and Mrs. Tremaine's head swiveled toward her. She began to move and Sarah screamed. Aidan dove for the light switches. There were 4 of them and he slammed them all down with a swipe of the hand. The foyer was plunged into pitch-black darkness, as were the porch and living room. Aidan, turn the lights back on right now. No, Dad, we can't, said Aidan. Oh, we most certainly can, and you will. I want to see if your mother's okay. I want those lights on now. In the darkness, Sarah felt Aidan brush past her as he whispered, I'm going to go turn off the circuit breaker. A moment later, she heard him in the kitchen, opening and closing the door in the basement, flicking on the stairway light. His footsteps raced downstairs. Aidan, Sarah, the lights now. Sorry, Dad, said Sarah. What is wrong with you kids? Stay here, Nat. I'm going to go find the lights. She heard Tom fumbling along the wall. This is outrageous behavior, he said. The lights came back on, and Tom was by the light switches blinking. Natalie sat slumped on the wall, dazed. Mrs. Tremaine was directly in front of Sarah, facing her. The sunglasses were gone. Her eyes were two huge black voids. Sarah screamed. Mrs. Tremaine moved forward. Sarah felt the awful cold, and then the lights went out again. What the? Who did that? Sarah stumbled backward. The cold was gone, but she was disoriented, almost too weak to stand. She heard Aidan running up the stairs and opening the basement door. Sarah, he called. You turn those lights on right now, mister. Here, said Sarah to her brother. All right, said Tom, his voice furious. I'm going to put the lights back on, and then you are both in major trouble. She heard him bumping into things as he worked his way towards the kitchen darkness. A moment later, she jumped as she felt a hand on her arm. It's me, said Aidan. Upstairs, now. They felt their way to the stairs and began climbing. From below came the awful sound, the grotesque cold moan. You will give it to me. The front door cried on its hinges, and Aidan and Sarah looked back as the street light seeped through the open doorway. In the dim light, they saw the silhouette of Mrs. Tremaine gliding down the front walk, turning left and then disappearing. They ran the rest of the way upstairs. We gotta leave, said Sarah. I know. Right now before Dad finds the circuit breaker. I know. Grab your phone and whatever money you have. I'll get the box of my phone and money, and we'll go out the back. What if he's out there? We have no choice. We can't let it come back here. It'll get Mom and Dad. A pause. Then Aidan said, Yeah, okay. From the basement came the sound of a collision, possibly with the paint shelf. They heard their father cursing. They were gone before the lights came back on. That's the end of the chapter. So we really see things ramp up here because, one, Umbra has obviously followed them back home, but two, Aidan and Sarah make a difficult decision in that they're going to leave home to keep their parents safe. What I want to know from you, and you can tell me this however you want, is do you think that's a wise idea? Do you think they should have stayed put? Do you think they should have gotten rid of the box? And do you think it's the right move to run away, to get away from Umbra? So things, now that we're back in the United States, will really start to heat up. I think I will do a chapter tomorrow, even though it's a Friday. You don't necessarily have to listen to it. But that chapter will be called Into the Darkness, since they're running away at night. All right.